Welcome to the Next Level Human podcast. As a human, you have a job to do. In fact, you have 4 jobs: to earn and manage money, to attain and maintain health and fitness, to build and sustain personal relationships, to find meaning and make a difference. None of these jobs are taught in school, and that is what this podcast is designed to do. To educate us all on living our most fulfilled lives through the mastery of these 4 jobs. I'm your host, Dr. Jade, Teta, and I believe we are here living this life for 3 reasons and 3 reasons only: to learn, to teach, and to love. In this podcast, I will be learning, teaching, and loving right along with you. I'm grateful to have your company. Here's to our next level. Today, we're going to be talking about calories. This entire episode is going to be on the topic of calories. And you might say, well, Jade, why are you covering calories? And the reason I want to cover this is because this, to me, is one of those areas that is obviously commonplace. Everyone knows and has heard about calories and the idea of a calorie deficit and the fact that calories matter. Some people think they don't matter and you don't need to count them. Other people think calories are everything. There's arguments about calories versus hormones and what should we be tracking and all of these things. And so I wanted to cover this based on multiple questions and multiple discussions that I've had in this arena when we're trying to determine, should we be counting calories or not? How important are calories to weight loss? And what are the things that we need to understand about this? So let's get into this discussion. The first thing that we need to understand, I think, is the idea that when we are thinking about weight loss and perhaps fat loss in particular, but just the idea of losing weight, we absolutely have to look at the idea of just energy in and energy out. In other words, there are some basic laws of physics that are at play with everything in the world, including the human body. And so when you look at it just from an energetic point of view, there is no doubt that it is true that energetically speaking, your metabolism acts like an engine in a sense. And so it absolutely is going to need a certain amount of fuel. And it absolutely is going to store fuel away for a rainy day if it gets too much energy. And if it does not get enough energy, it should then, of course, be dipping into those storage depots. The fact, though, is that, yes, the metabolism is very much like the first law of thermodynamics. Energy can neither be created nor destroyed. However, it also functions in a real live system, not a closed system. So if we're going to look at the laws of physics, then the second law of thermodynamics, the law of entropy, which essentially says that all biological entities or systems are going to lose energy. And not just biological systems, but all systems eventually will lose energy. And so that energy may not be created nor destroyed, but it can be lost in other forms. For example, it can be lost in the form of heat. And so when we're burning fuel, let's say, and we eat certain foods, some of that energy is going to be captured and some of it will be lost. Now, the amount that went in has to equal the amount that goes out, but the amount that goes sort of out does not always just relate to moving muscle. It could be lost as heat as well. And so the idea here is that, yes, it is useful at a very sort of simplistic level to think about energy in and energy out being more like a calculation. But once we get into the real way this works, not in a closed laboratory setting, we see that in the human body, that this energy can take different forms. It can be sort of muted into movement. It can be lost as heat and so on. Then the third component of this is that certainly there is an adjustable nature of the metabolism. The metabolism would not be very good at helping our survival if it did not have a way of adjusting and adapting to high energy states and low energy states by ramping up its use of fuel or ramping down its use of fuel. In a very simple way of looking at this, you could think of somebody who is driving a car and the car is low on gas. They're not going to be revving their engine at stoplights, right? Because they're going to use up that fuel and they know it. It's the same thing that the body does. If the body has a ton of extra fuel, maybe it will rev its engine at stoplights. But if it doesn't, it's going to start to conserve and use the gas sparingly and perhaps coast whenever it can. And this is partly what goes on here. And so there's a realization among individuals that the calorie phenomena, when it's just looked at through the lens of a calculator, is wrong. However, when we take that calorie phenomenon, we start looking at the way the actual body works with calories, we can create a more realistic situation in terms of how to manage calories. And so from that perspective, I oftentimes say there are two things required for sustained fat loss. And I'm using the word sustained and fat loss on purpose here, right? So sustained fat loss, we need two things. We need one, a calorie deficit, and second, we need a sustained calorie deficit. So how do we sustain a calorie deficit? Well, we sustain a calorie deficit by not being controlled by our hunger and our cravings. And so what controls hunger and cravings? These are hormones. When I say hormones, I'm almost always talking about stress hormones and hunger hormones and things like that. Whereas most people think sex steroids, testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone. They play a role, but they play a role because they are impacting hunger and stress hormones primarily. And so what we want to be looking at is we want to be looking at this two-part equation. Yes, a calorie deficit is required for weight loss and fat loss. And then two, a sustained calorie deficit, which is achieved by hormonal balance, which actually helps to maintain that calorie deficit, plus help us lose fat more readily than losing fat and muscle per se, for example. And so what we want to be looking at is we want to be looking at this equation. So that brings to our mind, should we be counting calories in general? And what I oftentimes say is that calories are critical and perhaps most critical. In other words, the gap between energy intake and output is absolutely essential to understand and critical for body change. So calories are very important. However, they don't always need to be counted. But this gets us into this place because some people then go, well, that means they should never be counted. And that actually is not the case. Something needs to be counted. It just does not always have to be calories. However, when we count these somethings, we're almost always counting calories, either directly or indirectly. So let me explain. Whenever we decide we're going to reduce a certain macronutrient, like we're going to count carbohydrates and not go past 100 grams of total carbs or not go past 50 grams of net carbs, let's say. In a sense, we're counting calories. A lower carb diet is also a lower calorie diet, all else being equal, right? Let me say that again. A lower carb diet, if we just cut carbohydrates out of the diet and leave everything else the same, that is also going to be a lower calorie diet, is it not? And so a lower calorie diet too, all else being equal, taken from multiple places, fat, carbs, and protein, is also going to be a lower carb diet as well. So to some degree, you can't separate out macros and calories. If you decrease a particular macronutrient and all else stays the same, then you are also decreasing calories. If you're decreasing calories equally across the board from all the macronutrients, then you are also creating a lower carb or a lower fat or a lower protein state. Not everyone thinks in these terms. They tend to think that macronutrients are counted separately from calories. But don't forget, A gram of carbohydrate has 4 calories. A gram of protein has 4 calories. A gram of fat has 9 calories. And so whenever you are counting macros, you are also necessarily decreasing the calorie level as well. Now, in the real world, oftentimes what happens is if we go on a low carb diet, oftentimes the carbohydrate percent of calories goes down, but that is oftentimes made up for by an increase in calories in fat and or protein. And the degree to which that increase does not create a calorie deficit is the degree to which that diet won't work. In other words, what I'm saying is if a keto diet works, it works because it lowers calories. If a low carbohydrate diet works, it works because it lowers calories. Works here meaning causes weight loss. If a high protein diet works, it works because it lowers calories, right? What I mean by that is if you eat more protein, then perhaps you offset fat and carbs, because you're satiated and not having as many cravings. No, protein is notorious for this. And we've oftentimes seen people who eat high protein diets oftentimes spontaneously, accidentally reduce calories. Now, this is the benefit actually of some of these approaches. One of the benefits of a keto diet is to be able to simply make fat or carbohydrate rather reduction the goal, the single thing you're counting, and hope that calories will take care of themselves. And they often do, but not always. And this is part of the problem here, is because people get confused by this. And unfortunately, we tend to make these broad sweeping assumptions in our brain where we essentially go, well, if someone eats more high quality food, then they automatically are going to reduce calories. This is the argument is, if someone eats healthier, they should lose weight, but not if it doesn't cause a calorie deficit. It oftentimes will. It just does not always. And this is the dilemma we get into, because what happens is calories are always at play. They always matter whether or not you are counting them or not. This is absolutely critical to understand, and for some reason, people lose this thread. If a diet works, whether it's because you've decreased meals and you're intermittent fasting, or you're on a keto diet and measuring ketones, or you're eating a high protein, moderate fat, low carb diet, or you're eating a vegan or vegetarian diet, whatever you are doing, it is working. If it works, it is working because it is also creating an energy deficit. This is absolutely truth in the research. This is clear. You cannot lose weight without a calorie deficit. Now, does that mean that you need to count calories specifically? No, you don't. You don't necessarily need to count calories. However, you may very likely, and I would say for most people, they do need to count something. And that could be any number of things. In fact, there is an argument to be made that the most effective diets are the ones that are easiest to track. For example, one of the reasons the keto diet has become so effective and so popular is that for those who measure, it is pretty easy to measure ketones with a keto meter. And what we're really measuring here is ketonemia, ketones in the blood, not necessarily ketones in the urine. Ketones in the blood is what you want. And you can measure these things, and a level of 1 to 3 on one of these keto meters will tell you that you are in ketosis, high enough amplification of the ketogenesis or the ketone process, the biogenesis of ketones, which tells us that we're using fat and ketogenic amino acids to make ketones for energy. At the same time, this is a really useful thing because when you measure it, you can see very clearly, oh, I am either in ketosis or not in ketosis. It's fairly easy to see. Now, you might say, well, that means we're losing weight, correct? Not necessarily. And this is the part that gets confusing because you can be in ketosis, You can be registering 1 to 3 on a keto meter and still not losing weight because you're one of these people who is overeating even high fat foods. And many people can do this. Many people do this. And if you're not losing weight on one of these diets, then you are 100% exactly doing that. Either you are not achieving a calorie deficit, or you are isocaloric, meaning that, the amount of calories that you need is equal to the amount that you're taking in. And some people can even gain weight on these diets. Now, this is something that needs to be talked about. To me, it's funny that I even need to do podcasts like this. And the reason it gets so confusing for people, because what people are steeped in is they're steeped in, one, their own experience, and two, their own biased intake of documentaries, books, etc. What do I mean by their own biased intake? Well, the books you read, the documentaries you look at, the blogs you look at, the podcasts you listen to are oftentimes biased towards what you already believe. And so very few people are actually reading vegetarian and vegan diets when they themselves prefer to eat meat. However, if you really wanted to know the truth of diet and get the best understanding, you would be reading from all these places. Now, when you have someone like me and other people like me who have worked with thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of individuals, you see right away how silly it is to base your dietary opinions based on what works for you and your narrow reading material. This is critical to understand. And so the fact is, you always have to count something. Now, let's get into this for a little bit. So you might say, well, Jade, what do you mean by you always have to count something? There are certainly many people for who eating better leads to eating less, and they don't even have to worry about it. They know that they've achieved a calorie deficit. How? They know because they're losing weight. And we're going to cover this in just a minute, but the only true way, and this is where it gets confusing and frustrating, the only true way to know if you've achieved the calorie deficit is if you are losing weight. This is the only way to actually know. And this gets us into why a lot of people have abandoned the idea of counting calories. First of all, let's cover a couple things. With calories, even if you're using something like MyFitnessPal or other tracking devices that tell you how many calories are in a food, you should know that these have been shown to be up to 20% incorrect. Now, that doesn't mean they're always 20% in the high level. They could be 20% in the low level. But in general, these tracking softwares and food labels and all of this kind of thing are not exactly accurate from the perspective of exact amounts of calories. In fact, they're about 20% off. And we probably could say with a good guess that most of them are overestimated. And so right away, this is an issue. This is an issue in being able to track calories in a way that is definitive and defined. You really can't. Now, the other thing is that about 30% of people, even if they were accurate, right? Let's say that the calories that you're tracking are exactly accurate. What's in MyFitnessPal and some of these other tracking softwares is 100% accurate. What we also know from the research is that about 30% of what we eat, which is essentially a whole meal per day, it goes unaccounted for over time. And this will take some explanation. Here's what I mean. What most people think, because we have a very human brain, is they tend to think in days, right? Here's how many calories I had at this meal and this day. And we don't really get too savvy past that because we can't remember what we had 4 days ago. However, the metabolism does remember what you had 4 days ago. And it does look at not hours and days, but weeks and months. And so here's an example of what happens. Let's say you eat in a 200 calorie deficit. And let's assume that that's exact, but you eat in a 200 calorie deficit for Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. So 5 days you've had a 200 calorie deficit each day. That's a total calorie deficit of 1,000 calories, right? That's how the metabolism looks at this. And of course, it's a week, so you might even be able to track this. So you have 5 days where you've eaten very clean, and you've tracked your calories, and you have 1,000 calorie deficit, which should over time help you lose weight. However, on the weekend, let's say you ease up a little bit, and on Saturday you overeat by 700 calories, and on Sunday you overeat by 700 calories. So on those 2 days, you've created a 1,400 calorie excess. So now you've got 5 days totaling 1,000 calorie deficit and 2 days totaling a 1,400 calorie excess. The way the metabolism looks, it doesn't look at you ate good 5 days and ate poorly 2 days. It just goes, overall, you've got a 400 calorie excess. And what happens is over time, this is what humans do. They forget to log the time, the 2 or 3 drinks they had on Saturday night. They forget to log the binge meal they had 2 weeks later. And over the course of a month, what ends up happening is because you forgot to log all of these things, you're about 30% off. And this has been shown in research on free living humans who are eating normally and trying to track their calories. And then when the researchers come behind them and actually look, they'll actually say, actually, you ate on average about 30% more over this month than you thought. So not only are calorie calculations about 20% off for foods and on food labels and things like that, but you're going to be 30% off on average over the course of a month, which is one of the reasons when I've worked clinically, I oftentimes like to build in a fudge factor of about 250 to 500 calories. In other words, when I calculate the need of someone's calories, which you really can't know, which we'll talk about here in a minute, I'll oftentimes say, all right, and let's just go ahead and subtract out another 250 or 500 calories from this, given that we know there's going to be a fudge factor in here as well. So you can build that in. But the major point here is that you can't actually know anyway. Now, you've probably heard all kinds of different calculations and how you should get your calories. Some people say, all right, and I use these same things, by the way, and I'll explain to you why they don't work and why they're still useful. So the easy way to do the calorie thing is to say, okay, my basal metabolic rate, if I was going to guess yours, it's basically your weight in pounds times 10. This is a pretty good estimate in an area that is, fraught with all kinds of issues, but this is a decent estimate without doing all kinds of calculations, without doing a total daily energy expenditure calculation or anything like that, without sending you into the lab to do your basal metabolic rate, which has to be done first thing in the morning on an empty stomach in the dark without you getting up. That's the traditional way that you would get your basal metabolic rate in a true laboratory setting. But the bottom line is 10 times your body weight in pounds is a decent way to look at that. So I'm 225 pounds. If I use this formula, I can say, okay, a decent estimate for me to be in a calorie deficit is 2,250 calories, 10 times my body weight in pounds. I'm sorry to break into the show, but I wanted to take a second to cover one of our sponsors and tell you all about Paleo Valley at paleovalley.com. These are the grass-fed sticks that I tell you all so much about that all of my friends know I have on hand constantly. They are in my car. They are at my house. I keep them at my sister's home and my parents' house. I have these things everywhere because they are the simplest, most convenient whole foods protein supplement you can get. Almost like carrying around pure protein, low-carb protein in your pocket. These Paleo Valley beef sticks are the only 100% grass-fed and grass-finished beef sticks on the market. They use organic spices. They are naturally fermented instead of using nitrates and nitrites that can be a problem in some of these cured meats, and they simply taste fantastic. Check out the original or the jalapeno. Those are my favorites. Please make sure you go over to paleovalley.com and visit. When checking out, use the code NEXTLEVEL for a 15% discount. Remember, Our sponsors keep the show going by you giving them your patronage and spending your money on these high quality products. You actually do a few things. One, you're helping to support the podcast. And two, you are helping your health. And three, you are making sure that good quality companies like Paleo Valley can be out there doing their business, changing the world, making the earth better. One of the things you may not know about this is that grass-fed organic and grass-finished beef is doing something that is so utterly important for our environment, actually helping to repopulate the topsoil. A lot of people don't know this, but our topsoil is being extremely depleted. And raising animals, especially cattle, the correct way helps to get that topsoil back. This is one of the reasons why I love Paleo Valley. Not to mention it tastes fantastic, but they're one of these companies, like my other sponsors, Cured Nutrition and Organifi, that are doing the right things by the environment. I really appreciate everything they do, and I hope you will check them out. Thanks so much. PaleoValley.com. Use the code NEXTLEVEL. And now, back to the show. It is time to talk about one of our sponsors, our earliest sponsor, Cured Nutrition. This is a CBD company. Cured Nutrition is another one of those next level human companies that is doing amazing things in the world. Let me tell you a little bit about one of the things I've been doing with CBD here recently. There is some really interesting research showing that chronic cannabis users, these are people who are smoking marijuana, are actually down-regulating the cannabinoid 1 receptor. Well, guess what the cannabinoid 1 receptor is involved in? Well, it's involved in cravings and hunger. And there is some really interesting mouse research that shows mice given products that lower CB1 or being engineered with a lower CB1 activity actually eat less and are not obese as a result of that. And so I have been experimenting using CBD to lower hunger, to down-regulate the CB1 receptor, just the way chronic cannabis users tend to be very thin. And it has been working very well. Now, of course, the other thing that I use this for and have used it for since day one is Cured Nutrition has a product called Zen that is a mix of magnesium and CBD and some other really nice formulations in there that I use to help me sleep. I have notoriously bad sleep. My sleep still is not perfect, but the Cured Nutrition product Zen has made a big difference to helping me sleep better. And that is just huge. Now, of course, they have other products. They also have a product called Rise, which I do not use, but I have used in the past. It is great for those people who like to have a pick-me-up in the morning to focus better. So Zen and Rise are fantastic, but any of their CBD products used for downregulation of the CB1 receptor to help with hunger and cravings, if you're one of these people who is constantly overeating and on a diet, you find that, hey, when I'm on a diet, I get this crazy sort of hunger and cravings. This may be something you want to check out. So check out curednutrition.com. Use the code NEXTLEVEL. I get a kickback to help us have these discussions on the show. It's a great way for me to be able to do this work. So thank you for Cured Nutrition for that. Of course, Cured Nutrition gets the sale, and you get to work with a fantastic company that gets results with their supplements. I hope you will check them out. curednutrition.com. Use the code NEXTLEVEL. And now let's go ahead and get back to the show. Let's do it. This is a decent way to look at this. This is a general sort of rule for basal metabolic rate. That's not counting all the non-exercise associated thermogenesis, activities of daily living, thermic effect of food, the exercise that I do. This is just what it would take to keep me alive. That's a decent estimate. Now, the bottom line is, though, I can tell you for me that I don't typically lose weight on 2,200 calories a day. It takes me about 2,000 calories. Part of this has to do with my hypothyroid condition, which probably lowers my basal metabolic rate a little bit further. Not to mention 10 times my body weight in pounds is not a true estimate. It's not exact. It's wildly estimated, in fact. And even if I went and got the laboratory measure of my basal metabolic rate, this is just a measure in time. The metabolism is not a static linear thing. It fluctuates. It fluctuates based on how much activity you're doing, how much you're eating, how much you're not eating, the stress you have, how well you're sleeping. All of these things are going into the amount of calories you need on a particular day. And so even if you went and got the laboratory done, it's not going to be the same. Maybe it's that day, it's going to be slightly up or down based on your living habits and everything else moving forward from there. But we can certainly start somewhere. And this does have use because most people that I have worked with who are amateurs, novices in weight loss, have no idea what they are actually consuming. For example, they don't know that a quarter cup of granola is about 200 calories. And they don't realize that when they do a full cup, which is pretty damn small. When you look at a cup of granola is a very small amount in a bowl, you're looking at anywhere from 500 to 800 calories for an amount of food that doesn't look like a lot. And this is what people do constantly because they've never actually learned what the energy density is of the foods that they are eating. They don't realize that a tablespoon of butter is 100 calories and that adding 2 tablespoons of butter into your cooking over the course of a day can completely wipe out a calorie deficit, right? They don't realize this. They don't realize that putting full cream in, your cup of coffee in the amount that most people might use is going to be anywhere from 50 to 150 extra calories. And so what happens is people disconnect what they are eating from how much energy it has. And part of the benefit of counting calories, perhaps the only benefit of counting calories or counting and measuring and weighing things, is to associate the energy density of a particular food with how it looks. A lot of people don't realize that a boneless, skinless chicken breast, 8 ounces of that is about 250 to 300 calories. Leaving the skin on adds about another 100 to 150 calories. These are things that are useful to know. And so counting, weighing, and measuring is a quintessential tool needed by many people who are eating freely in the world and don't realize how much they're over consuming. Here's an example from my own world. So my family are pretty big eaters. We're Italian. We eat pasta. We love that kind of stuff. A lot of people in my family love avocados. My mother is really big on fruit. When I was working with my mom, when she was going through menopause, back then I was one of these people that was on board with all the different trends. And I was like, oh, we're going to do low carb and high intensity interval training. Many of you may have followed my work back then. A lot of that work had gone into my first book. And over time, I've just realized that you cannot do cookie cutter nutrition that way. But one of the things I saw with my mom is that she was eating avocados and lots of fruits. I told her eat less starches, eat fruits, vegetables, lean protein, and plenty of fat. What she was doing was overeating pretty significantly avocados and fruit. And she started to gain weight. Not only did she not lose it when she was asking me to help her, she started gaining weight. And what kind of blew my mind at the time is the fact that, I can't overeat avocado. A lot of people can't. My mom absolutely could and was just crushing avocado. And many people can. Many people can overeat healthy foods. I wouldn't say most, but many. And those people struggle because they never learn the calories associated with these healthy foods. And so counting, weighing, and measuring is perhaps most important, not because of the calorie levels and the fact that that's an exact science, but it's mostly important understanding that while it may not be, we may not know exactly how many calories are in a quarter cup of granola per se, maybe it's 20% off, we can see it's an awful lot. And we can see how small that looks. And we can see that if we're going to do a cup and a half or 2 cups of granola, we've just consumed 1,200 calories perhaps. And a lot of people do not understand this. And this is why this is critically important. Now, again, do we need to count calories? No, we don't. Are they critically important? absolutely, perhaps most important. And if you're somebody who is not getting results taking a quality first approach, you will eventually have to take a quantity first approach. Now, in truth, quality and quantity cannot be separated. We've talked a little bit about this. What people oftentimes miss is that a low carb diet, like I said before, is a low calorie diet, a lower calorie diet than it was before, all else being equal. And a low calorie diet is a lower carbohydrate diet than it was before, all else being equal. This is true of all macronutrients. So it's very difficult to tease this out. We get into issues when we cut down one macronutrient and dramatically raise the other one in response. And for people who are volume eaters, these are people who literally eat based on how much food is in front of them. This can be a problem. For example, carbohydrate foods typically have a lot more volume than fat foods, right? And so in other words, a pat of butter, which has 100 calories, that's going to be a half cup of, let's say, starch or high fiber bread or something like that. And so it's a little bit different here. Like, for example, a high fiber bread can have about 80 calories in it. It's much bigger than a pat of butter that has 100 calories in it. And so just moving from fat to carbs for some people elevates calories. And this is why you hear people say, I gained weight on a keto diet. And all the keto fiends and people like that say that can't happen. I can tell you definitively it can, and it does. It's not what happens most of the time, but it happens often enough that it is something that you need to be aware of. So the idea here then is, and the question in your head should be like, well, Jade, then what should we really be counting? You're saying we need to count something. Are calories the number one thing that we should count? I would say probably not, although it is something that you need to be aware of, that you might need to count for some time if you're not someone who has very good intuition about what foods contain what. And most people don't. This is why intuitive eating for a lot of people does not work, because intuitive eating requires experience. What a lot of people don't know is intuition is not magic. For some reason, people continue to think that intuition is just this magical sense. It's not. Intuition is like a sixth sense, basically, and it comes from the integration of all your other senses plus a large amount of experience. This is why when you researchers who study intuition understand that you can't actually have intuition in an area that you are unfamiliar with. For example, pilots have intuition because they've taken off and landed tens and thousands of times. So their intuition becomes very, very acute, which is why someone like Sully, who landed his plane on the Hudson River and knew he couldn't get back to the airport, his intuition told him, because he could feel the way the plane felt. And that intuition served him. Someone who's weighed, tracked, and measured food over years and years and years has a tremendous intuition around food. For example, my intuition around food, I can be at an all-you-can-eat buffet, have a huge pile of food, all different types, and give you a rough estimate about how many calories that plate might have, about how many grams of protein it might have versus fat versus carbs, because I have seen, weighed, measured food over years and years and years. And I no longer have to, because I have a pretty fine-tuned intuition around calories now. But the fact remains, calorie levels, getting exact calorie levels, are virtually impossible to get. And so the only true way, and this is probably the biggest take home in this podcast, the only true way you can know if you are actually in a calorie deficit is if you are losing weight. That's the only true way to know. You will lose weight once the body energy intake does not exceed its output. Or said another way, the amount of energy the body needs to do everything it needs to do in the day is not accounted for with the amount of food that you're eating. That's when you're going to lose weight. And what's interesting about that is that this is a moving target, because if you decrease your calories, and this is why it is such a tricky situation, if you decrease your calories and you're losing weight, doesn't mean you're going to continue to lose weight. The body then sees, okay, I'm in an energy deficit, and the degree to which it sees that calorie gap as a stress, intake versus output, the distance between the two, it will put in many different mechanisms to slow metabolic rate, to increase hunger and cravings, to close that gap back down, to protect against perceived starvation. And so, again, this is one of the issues that comes up here, is that once you find a calorie deficit and start to achieve weight loss, typically that weight loss will slow or stop, and then you need to achieve another calorie deficit. And pretty soon you can be at very, very low energy intake and still not losing weight. And this is one of the major drawbacks to taking a calories first approach for many people, but not all. So there is this back and forth here. Yes, it's important to know the energy density of the foods you're consuming, which is useful from a calorie perspective, even if we can't know for sure. On the other hand, if you're only always taking a calories first approach and just looking at food quantity rather than quality, then you are almost always going to end up in this point of diminishing returns where calories are so low that you can't go any lower and have any degree of functionality and energy and all these kinds of things in life. Which brings us back to what I talk about all the time. You need hormonal metabolic balance, the idea of SHMEC in check, sleep, hunger, mood, energy, and cravings. SHMEC, SHMEC, that tells you that the metabolic hormonal balance is there. And then you can be operating from a place of strength and push the calories down until you begin to lose weight. Now, instead of, and this is what most people do, instead of continuing to go lower calorie when the plateau hits, what really should be happening when the plateau hits is for you to be going back to an isocaloric level. So this is that idea of the intermittent energy restriction we've talked about. We've talked about this multiple times. If this term is new for you, then go back in the episodes. There's one I did on the Matador study. There's one on intermittent energy restriction. But ultimately what intermittent energy restriction is, it's not the same as intermittent fasting. Essentially what it is diet breaks in a sense. So it says achieve a calorie deficit for a period of time and then go back to an isocaloric level. What most people do is they achieve a calorie deficit and then they go to hypercaloric levels. They go hypocaloric, low calorie, and then they're so hungry that they go hypercaloric, high calorie. When we're talking about intermittent energy restriction and calorie levels, what we want to do is go hypocaloric for a period of time and then go back to an isocaloric level. So you might say, well, Jade, how long should I go hypocaloric? How long should I do the caloric deficit? Well, until SHMEC goes out of check and or your weight loss plateaus, right? One or the other. Then you go back to an isocaloric level until SHMEC gets back in check. And then you go back to the calorie deficit again, and you go back and forth this way. And this is the way that you do this. Now, in general, we can come up with rules. So my idea here, and I'll make this super simple for you, is that for most people, counting calories probably is going to be only useful up to a point. Count calories until you understand caloric density, energy densities of foods. And then from there, you can begin to count something. You need to count something. You need to account for something having to do with meals. For example, if you're an intermittent faster, part of what you're doing is you're cutting out one of your meals, right? Now, if that is going to work for weight loss, what that means is that you're losing that meal's calories and you're not making up for those calories at future meals. In other words, let's say you have, to make the math easy, we'll just say, let's say you have a 1,500 calorie limit. That's your basal metabolic rate, let's say. And so you're eating 500 calories breakfast, 500 calories lunch, and 500 calories dinner. And you cut out breakfast. Then what you want is that 500 calories at lunch and that 500 calories at dinner to remain roughly the same. You don't want to start consuming 750 calories at lunch and 750 calories at dinner. You will not lose weight like that. You want to consume maybe 600 calories at lunch and 600 calories at dinner so that you are at 1,200 calories instead of 1,500 calories, right? And so if you're going to count meals, this is when they are appropriate, but you're still not going to lose weight just by skipping a meal if you make up for all those calories later. And many people do. They do intermittent fasting. They cut out breakfast. And as a result of cutting out breakfast, they end up overeating at both lunch and dinner. So instead of having now a 1,500 calorie deficit, they cut out the 500 calories at breakfast and they end up consuming 1,000 calories each at lunch and dinner as a result of that. Many people do this, not all. The ones who are successful are able to keep the calorie levels roughly the same at each meal and just cut one out. And so that would be counting meals. Intermittent fasting is a counting meals approach. A keto diet is a counting carbs approach. Typically, less than 50 grams of total carbohydrate per day is going to get the results. Some people need to go as low as 30. And it's also measuring ketones. But still, you're still going to have to make sure you don't make up the difference in protein or fat. Otherwise, you're not going to lose weight on those diets. So one of the things that I often talk about is simply not having to count calories, but doing things and eating in a way, higher quality foods that will elicit a natural calorie deficit. That's just not going to work for everyone. For example, if you elevate the amount of fiber you have in your diet from 30 grams per day to 50 grams per day, and you count that, and or you elevate the amount of protein you have per day, having at least the amount of the weight that you want to reach and as much of the amount of the weight that you currently are. High fiber and high protein meals like this, almost always, but not in all people, will lead to an accidental calorie deficit. And if it works, it's because it created a calorie deficit. So if it doesn't work, you'll want to go back and see, right? So one easy way to do this, for example, say, what are the calories I'm eating right now at maintenance? Because most people are not gaining or losing. They're at maintenance. So let's say I decide, okay, right now I'm eating 3,000 calories at maintenance. And I'm going to elevate my protein and my fiber intake. And all I'm going to do is count those things and then eat freely everywhere else. And then after a week, I lose weight. Then I can go back and say, okay, let me go back and look, what's a typical calorie intake that I'm eating right now? And I'll calculate that. And what you'll see is there's a difference there. And if I'm not losing weight, you'll see that there wasn't a difference. And this is another way to do this, just using calories to spot check where I'm at. So I decide I'm at maintenance right now, 3,000 calories. I'm going to start eating my body weight in pounds of grams of protein. So 225 grams of protein, that's all I count. I'm just counting grams of protein. And then after a week, I go back and say, oh, by the way, let me see how many calories I've consumed. And I discover I'm now consuming 2,700 calories, and that's leading to weight loss. Then that is great. I don't need to count calories every single day. I simply use my calorie levels as a spot check to see, did I make a difference? Now, instead, if I find out after adding 225 grams of protein daily, and I recalculate my calories, and I'm consuming 3,300 calories, and I've gained a little weight or haven't lost, that tells me why. So this is the better way to be using calories. It's basically just using it as another tool rather than the tool, right? And to make it as easy as possible. There are other ways to do this, by the way. I know some people who I've worked with who I basically tell, I want you to have 2 large salads every day. I just want you to count that. Just 2 large salads. That's the only thing you're going to count, 2 large salads. And as a result of those 2 large salads, a very simple way to hold in your head what I should be eating or not eating, those 2 large salads are going to create a calorie deficit or not. Now, I won't know exactly what that deficit is that's going to cause weight loss in you. All I know is that if I achieved weight loss by telling you to have 2 salads every day, what that means is those 2 salads filled you up and displaced other calories. And I can literally measure in general what you've been eating before that calorie-wise and what you're eating when you add those 2 things in, which is one of the reasons why when I am working with clients, one of the things that I always did is I would basically choose 3 things and 3 things only based on that particular person. These have been called different things, 3 keystone habits, 3 nutritional commitments. But essentially what a keystone habit is it is a habit that has trickle-down effects. For example, when I tell you to eat your body weight in pounds in grams of protein, One of the things that is a keystone habit. So you're counting grams of protein and you're getting so full off those grams of protein that it trickles down into cutting down your carbohydrates and cutting down your fats and cutting down your calories. And so it accidentally created a calorie deficit, but all you were doing was trying to eat more protein. Now, if I also tell you I want you to have one big salad per day, and that's the second nutritional commitment, and I also tell you I want you to have 4 liters of water every day, and that's the third nutritional commitment, you can see how all that extra water, all that extra fiber and roughage from that one big salad, and all that extra protein can easily, in some, but not everyone, probably in most, but not everyone, help you achieve an accidental calorie deficit and be much easier to manage. This is how you want to be thinking about calories. Calorie level should be a tool. And so demonizing calories and demonizing calorie counting is sort of like having a toolbox and saying, I don't need the hammer. I'm just going to throw it out because I don't like the idea of calories. Just because a hammer won't help you saw down a tree doesn't mean it's not an incredibly useful tool. And you're going to need that in your toolbox at some point. And so this is what people are essentially doing. They're just throwing out this idea of calorie counting because of all the issues that it presents. Yes, it's not exact. Yes, we're not very good counters. Yes, there's lots of issues with it. It can cause you to be food obsessed and other things. Yes, our metabolism adjusts, and so we never truly know what exactly the calorie deficit is going to be. But all we have to do is realize that energy intake versus energy out, if we achieve a calorie deficit, we will lose weight. And that's all we really need to know. So it's just a hammer. It's one tool in the toolbox to help us get where we need to get to. And it's an incredibly important toolbox because you don't need to call it calories, just call it energy. Physics tells us you cannot consume more energy than you burn and expect to lose weight. You must burn more energy than you consume, and then you will lose weight. So whether you call it calories or whether you call it energy units or whatever the hell you call it, it still has to conform to this. And we've covered all the other issues. So for me, for those of you listening to this and you're just like, well, okay, Jade, well, tell me then where to start. I would say this. First, understand which human are you? Do you know how many calories are in an egg? For example, it's about 70 calories. I know that right offhand. Do you know how many calories are in a typical piece of bread? If you're someone who's like, no, then you don't really have a good handle on the energy density of foods. And I would say you should track, weigh, and measure your foods for a period of time. Maybe a month, 2 or 3 months, so that you can get a handle on what you're eating that is very calorie dense. And then you can also see, okay, well, avocado, let's say I eat a lot of those, they're very calorie dense and it doesn't seem to satisfy me and make me cut my hunger down. Or you might say, well, even though this is calorie dense, it cuts my hunger down. So it's not just weight tracking and measuring. It's also saying, does this food help me eat less later? This is important for you to know. Now, if you're the other person who's like, I've weight tracked and measured, and I have a pretty good sense of the energy density of foods, then you can just choose any other thing to count. But if I was talking to most of you, what I would essentially say is, the best way to do this, and I think the way that right now the research shows is most beneficial, is simply to focus on your protein intake. For most people, the vast majority, of course, not all, there's always individual differences here, upping your protein level to somewhere between your desired body weight and your current body weight in grams of protein, right? So your desired body weight in pounds up to your current body weight in pounds. That's the amount of protein you want to eat, not to go below your desired weight in grams of protein and not to go above your current weight in grams of protein, and simply try to achieve that level. Now, if you're someone who has insatiable hunger and cravings like I tend to, you want to get, and you're also working out like crazy, you want to get closer to your pounds of body weight in grams of protein. Now, if you're someone who doesn't work out and isn't dealing with as much hunger, you can go down to where your desired body weight is. But this is a good rule of thumb. Simply count that. Before you begin counting your protein grams, do a 3-day diet recall. in MyFitnessPal or something like that and get a general idea of the amount of calories you're eating. Then start counting your grams of protein, only your grams of protein. And at the end of the week, look back at 3 days worth of your diet, calculate the calories, and see if you're achieving a difference between where you were at maintenance and where you're trying to get to lose weight. And this is the way that I would be doing this. Now, you also could add extra fiber. You also could add extra water. You could do anything you want, but whatever you do, it needs to achieve those two things: hormonal metabolic balance as measured by SHMEC and a calorie deficit. In other words, you need a calorie deficit plus a sustained calorie deficit. That's what SHMEC is. The hormonal metabolic is the sustained part. And so this is how you want to be thinking about calories. They are a tool. They matter. They matter most. They are also, it's not needed or necessary to always count them. However, those of you who are struggling to get results are going to want to pay attention to them, and to ignore them, you're ignoring them at your own peril. One of the final things I'll say here is, guess what is one of the major habits when we look at weight loss maintainers? There's a whole registry of individuals who have lost weight and kept the weight off. They've lost over 10% of their body weight and kept it off over years, 2 years, 3 years, etc. Some of them have lost well over hundreds of pounds. And we know their behaviors. And a couple of their behaviors are this: they're all exercisers, which speaks to exercise's benefit in maintaining weight loss. It's better at maintaining than attaining weight loss. In fact, it's not great at attaining weight loss. It's very good at maintaining weight loss. You want to attain weight loss through diet mainly, and you want to maintain weight loss with extra movement and exercise. They also all have some way of regulating their portion sizes and counting calories or macros or something. They're doing some kind of mindfulness measurement around food. Those two things are essentially what they do. So there's no getting around paying attention to what you are putting in your mouth and the energy density you are consuming. There is no way of getting around that. If you're someone who refuses to pay attention to what you are eating, quality, and how much you are eating, quantity, you're going to struggle at this forever. And so hopefully this helps you understand a little bit about how to manage calories. There is no exact number you can get that's going to give you the exact calories that you need. It's a fluctuating, moving target. If you are losing weight, you are achieving a calorie deficit, and that's the only way to know for sure. There are other ways to achieve a calorie deficit without stressing over all the different calories. You can count macronutrients. This will certainly lead for most people to lower calories. But eventually, you're always going to need to use that calorie tool to check based on where you were and how many calories you were consuming, and where you are now and how many calories you are consuming. Realizing that those numbers are not perfect, but they don't need to be perfect. They can certainly be a general guideline for us as we look at making these healthy lifestyle changes. So hopefully that's useful for you. I'm going to end the podcast right there. If you have any questions about this, as always, please DM me. Thank you so much for all of you who have been leaving reviews. I asked for reviews a couple episodes ago and have gotten a big handful of them. I always love seeing those. So if you feel so inclined, please support the podcast by leaving a review. Do a screenshot of that review, send it to me on my DM on social media. It'll help me get acquainted with you, and we can get to know each other there as well. Also, please, to support the podcast, please make sure that you frequent and give your business to the podcast sponsors. Goes a long way to allowing us to have these conversations. I want to say thanks so much, everyone, for hanging out, and I will see you at the next podcast.